Welcome, everyone. Is this on? Okay. I'm sorry it's an icebox in here. Hope you got some coffee to warm up. Well, welcome to our session here today on the revolution coming for the curb. My name's Regina Clewlow. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Populus. So we have three great speakers here today. I have Matty Schaefer here from VADE, CEO and co-founder of VADE. And then Andrew Glass-Hastings, who is the incoming executive director of the Open Mobility Foundation, an organization very critical to curb data standards. So we're going to go ahead and kick off. We're each going to present for about 10 minutes, and then we have a great Q&A planned with some pre-populated questions, but would love participation from the audience. So let's go ahead and dive in. So I'm going to start with a quick overview of curb and mobility management, and I'm going to zoom back a few years to when mobility management first became a phrase and new data standards really enabled cities to access better data from private operators. So first I'll kind of kick off with what are some of the key challenges at the curb? What is this concept, mobility management, and how are cities taking more active management of their critical assets such as curbs and streets? And then what is the role of data and data standards? But I won't go too in the weeds because Andrew can cover that topic pretty well as well. Next slide. So what is the key problem? Well, we've seen that over the last decade, a lot of new mobility services have arrived in cities. We have services like Uber and Lyft, which emerged about 10 years ago, the explosive growth of goods delivery, and then we had micromobility enter the scene. And over time, what's occurred is that cities have seen a whole host of issues that existed previously become a little bit more complicated to manage. So we have increased congestion, more complicated. We have new safety problems because you have more people on lower carbon modes, including bikes, shared bikes, and new shared mobility devices such as shared scooters that are now having to zip between commercial delivery vehicles, which are increasing day by day and were accelerated by the pandemic. Over the last 4 years, this new concept of mobility management arrived on the scene. It was in many ways spurred by the introduction of mobility data standards, such as the Mobility Data Specification, or MDS, which many cities are now able to leverage to require that different fleet operators share data with them. So for those of you who heard this morning, the comments around Chicago's Department of Transportation, the new mobility scooter program is going to launch in Chicago, as well as almost every other city in the United States and now internationally. Most cities are able to require that shared mobility operators of dockless scooters and bikes share data with them for purposes of transportation planning and policy. These fleet operators share data, and they have a lot of benefits that result from it, including the ability for cities to create more effective infrastructure, such as docked stations, dockless corrals for parking scooters, and then expanding bike infrastructure and scooter infrastructure that make it safer for these devices to ride. Populus is a mobility data platform that works with a number of cities. We now deliver data in over 100 cities around the world. A big part of that footprint's in North America. But our purpose is really to enable cities to easily pull in data securely from private fleet operators, create policies that are data-driven in order to more effectively manage the safety and transportation infrastructure that ultimately they are responsible for. So imagine, a city being able to price for any geography as this relates to commercial loading, to create congestion zones that they can apply an appropriate price to in order to optimize access to public space. Next slide. I started with micromobility. I know this particular session is focused on curb management, but the way that it relates to curb management is that micromobility in many ways has resulted in the most sophisticated digital parking solutions that exist in the industry. We really over-engineered for scooters, but now we're using that technology to help cities manage everything that moves. That includes their curbs. Next slide. So I'm going to segue now into the role of data and data standards. How many of you are familiar with CDS? Okay, handful of activists that are all in the planning committee. Okay, so what is CDS? So the curb data specification is a new data standard that was just released by the Open Mobility Foundation. They also released the mobility data specification. And what's interesting about data standards is that what we saw as a private company, as I'm sure a lot of scooter companies saw as well, the emergence of this data standard made it really easy for cities to move forward with new technologies that allowed them to plan more effectively and manage policies more effectively. And so CDS has just arrived on the scene. It was just approved this year over the last few weeks. And it is a way to help cities understand, how can they measure existing demand at their curbs? A lot of cities have very little information about the volume of activity happening at the curbs. How many delivery companies are making deliveries at a particular block, how many Ubers or Lyft are dropping off at a particular block, and how many other types of vehicles are using that space. A second key issue it addresses is how do we digitize curb regulations? So how many of you have ever seen a set of parking signs that are all stacked on top of each other and you're trying to figure out, what am I supposed to do in this space? So a lot of curb regulations only exist in the physical world. They don't exist in the digital world at all. And so big cities, small cities, all over the world, most have very little information about their curbs in a digital form that can easily be shared and that is consistent. And so that's another purpose of CDS, to help enable cities to be able to digitize their physical assets so they can share them with different stakeholders who might want to know, can I park in that space for free, or am I supposed to be charged, a few cents per hour? And so none of that information exists in digital form, and that's what these data standards are intended to help solve. And then lastly, there is a lot of other data that's out there, such as citation data, so violations for double parking, violations for parking and not paying for the curb when one is supposed to, that can also help cities make informed decisions about how that space is used. Next slide. So one of the interesting things we saw in the realm of micromobility is that a lot of cities had challenges when scooters first arrived. Any number of operators might have shown up with any number of vehicles. They were parked anywhere they wanted to. It sometimes, in some cases, made citizens angry and became politically complicated for some cities to manage. With the advance of mobility data standards in platforms like ours, cities were then more able to easily manage where those devices were parked by creating virtual corrals like this, where they could also stencil on the street to make it obvious where those vehicles should be parked, and then measure compliance with whether or not those parking areas were being utilized, and then could make decisions about where to place more of them. Next slide. So similarly, cities are very interested in determining how we can prevent behavior like this and create more sensible behavior like this in order to really effectively change how commercial delivery operators and other users of the curb space park their vehicles, so that we don't have blocked bike lanes, that cyclists need to move around, and so that those deliveries can hopefully be made much more efficiently than they are currently being made today. Next slide. So I'm going to share one final example from a city that we work pretty closely with, City of Oakland. It's one of our cities that utilizes our platform for micromobility management. They also now leverage our platform to manage car sharing services. So in this case, it's Gig Car Share. And what's interesting here is that Gig Car Share is an operator in the City of Oakland. They don't get ticketed for parking violations. They can park wherever they want in the city. Because we are helping them pay for their parking through our platform. So anywhere that there's a parked zone in the City of Oakland, these are usually in downtown areas that are more congested, we pull in the data for all their vehicles at all times, and then can produce a quarterly summary of how much parking they used in paid environments, and then they reconcile that directly with the city. So there are no parking meters required, there are no enforcement officers required. We simply digitally enforce their use of parking, and it works great for them. They actually voluntarily do this. The city doesn't make them utilize our platform in order to pay for that parked environment. Next slide. So Oakland has realized that commercial loading is really broken in their city. These are actually slides directly from the City of Oakland. They have a lot of different problems that they're trying to solve. One, delivery drivers aren't able to access loading zones because they're often occupied by personal vehicles, violating use of that space. Two, This is a really big problem in the Bay Area, but I'm sure in a lot of other cities. You have a lot of bicyclists and transit users that have to move around vehicles in an unsafe way, and it is causing more pedestrian and cyclist deaths in cities. And then parking enforcement is really difficult to enforce for short stops, such as an Uber and Lyft pulling over for only a minute or two, or even delivery operators. In front of our office in San Francisco, we have FedEx packages that are being delivered up and down the street, and those drivers are in and out in 2 minutes. And lastly, cities are not getting revenue for a lot of the use of that space. And how many of you guys think it's reasonable that a city should have revenue from Uber, Lyft, and Amazon using access to space when most people pay for personal parking? All right, next slide. So Oakland is moving forward to code their curb and update policies for use of the curb. The first thing they're doing is creating new metered yellow zones that are going to be priced. They're creating a new permit that is going to allow for parking by a lot of the big commercial fleet operators without feeding a meter. So they've hosted a number of community stakeholder meetings, and the number one thing they hear from companies like UPS, Amazon, and FedEx is, I can't make my drivers do anything. I'm not going to have them feed the meter. I'm not going to have them download an app to pay for space. What are my options? And so the option that they're introducing is essentially Pay by Populus, which is GPS-enabled digital enforcement, just as we do for scooters, just as we do for car sharing, and just as we'll be able to do for commercial operators. So we're going to calculate that usage digitally. And what's next? Cities around the world, because of the introduction of CDS, are now racing to code their curbs. They all know that they need to manage the space more effectively. What we're finding is a lot of operators are willing to come to the table because right now they're already paying enormous amounts of money for inefficiencies at the curb. Number one, their drivers are getting tickets. You've probably seen like multi-million-dollar fines that they pay in New York City. And number two, they currently waste about 30% of their time looking for parking. So there's a number of studies out of UW's Urban Logistics Lab that show that drivers are wasting a ton of time because they don't have access to space. And we're excited at Populus to help deliver new technologies that really enable better use of this space, and look forward to the discussion today. So thank you. So now I'm going to hand things over to Andrew Glass Hastings, the Mint. Yes.
The Mint. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so whether or not it's the after lunch sort of lull or you're cold and need to get the blood flowing, this is an interactive part of our session. So if you're able, stand up if you answer yes to these questions, or feel free to raise your hand as well. It won't, trust me, it won't take very long. So thinking about the curb, how many of you have ever had groceries delivered? All right, lots of hands. How many of you have ever had a meal delivered? Lots of hands. How many of you have ever taken Lyft or Uber? Almost everybody. All right. And how many of you have had an Amazon package delivered? All right. So there's probably several commonalities between all of these different activities. But the primary similarity or commonality that I want to emphasize is they all use the curb. They all require you to either pick up or drop off either your package, your food, your ride at the curb. The curb, I'm sure you've heard described as one of the most valuable real estate sources in cities today, and I think that's absolutely true. So my name is Andrew Glass Hastings, and I am, as Regina mentioned, the incoming head of the Open Mobility Foundation. In a former life, I was the director of transit and mobility for the city of Seattle, and within that role, I oversaw parking and curb space management. And one of the tasks, I guess, we had in that role was to assess the use of a commercial loading zone in front of the Pike Place Market. Now, hopefully some of you have visited the Pike Place Market. We're trying to build a streetcar in front of the Pike Place Market, but the vendors at the market were very concerned about the loss of this commercial loading zone. So we actually hired a consultant. This feels like way back in the analog days, but hired a consultant to set up a camera to monitor the loading zone so we could actually understand who was using it. Because lo and behold, we had labeled this curb, valuable real estate, as commercial loading zone, but we had no idea how it was being used, whether it was being used efficiently, whether it was being misused. And so we had, over the course of 48 hours, we actually had video sort of proof of how this was being used throughout the day during the week in particular. And what we identified is that space that was supposed to be used for primarily commercial goods loading and unloading was being used about 80% of the time for anything but. Mostly being used by Lyft and Uber, picking up and dropping off passengers. Now, passengers are not commercial loading activities under the definitions within the city of Seattle, at least. So there was a problem, and we heard very clearly from the delivery operators, FedEx, UPS, Amazon, that they could not use this very valuable curb space, and in fact, we're seeing increasing delivery times, inefficient and safety concerns as their drivers were trying to make deliveries elsewhere. So it was leading to a significant problem. But we would have never known this, I guess, if we weren't actually trying to build a streetcar and impacting this commercial loading zone. But it, I think Matty's going to talk a little bit about an easier way of doing this in the couple minutes here. But it goes to the point of really important in how the curb, actually understanding how the curb is being used, and then proper management. So now on to the Open Mobility Foundation. Really the focus of OMF is digital infrastructure, and using digital infrastructure to help cities manage public space for the public good. We are a public-private foundation that is led by cities and supported by private companies, really focusing on data standards and open source software tools. And it's really at its foundation focused on bringing together the cities as the operators and managers and policymakers of the right-of-way and of mobility in cities at the table with the providers and operators who are using that space. Next slide. So OMF is an organization that has 50 plus members all over the world, North America primarily, and as Regina mentioned, we're the kind of governing entity of the Mobility Data Specification, which is now used by over 120 cities around the country. So the organization is continuing to grow. Next slide. So talking a little bit more about the curb data specification, you can go to the next one there. Back up until really recently, we relied on physical infrastructure to communicate to the public. So just like Regina mentioned, we relied on signs, we relied on actual meters, we relied on wayfinding and actual traffic cops, if you will, to help communicate the city's rules and regulations. So now we've gotten into the realm of algorithms and digital infrastructure to communicate those same policies and rules both to the public, but then also somewhat more, not necessarily more importantly, but equally as important, to the operators who are trying to use that space on a daily basis. So CDS has several benefits for cities, which are an important part of that public-private partnership. It really gives local governments the tools to drive the data-informed change that they're looking to make. So they need to know, just like I mentioned in my example with the curb loading zone in front of the Pike Place Market, cities need to know what's happening on their curbs in order to be able to make the changes that they're looking for. It allows cities to map curb regulations and capture that data about how it's being used in a consistent and reliable format. It supports public spaces that hopefully better reflect the community priorities, and it unlocks an ecosystem of tools that will really help keep cities at the center of managing complex mobility environments. It also, next slide, also has a significant benefit to the companies, to the operators themselves that are trying to do business within the public right-of-way. It gives these curb users real-time understanding of where the nearest available curb spaces are and what rules apply to them. So just like with the mobility data specification, where no matter what city an operator, a micromobility operator is in, they understand the data requirements and data fields that are required to operate in that city. CDS is similar. So regardless of which city an operator, whether that's FedEx, UPS, Amazon, or even passenger services, think taxis, car share, and TNCs as well. The rules city by city will ultimately differ, but the data standards, the language that those operators and cities are speaking will be consistent. It will help cities to deploy demand-responsive curb regulations what I kind of call the gold standard, which is active management, dynamic management of the curb, and really sets the stage for cities to adopt the curb to support all the types of cutting-edge changes that will inevitably come, whether that's setting the scene for autonomous vehicles, autonomous delivery bots, or even aerial mobility in the future. Next slide. So how does CDS work? I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty, partly because I don't yet understand it, but I will very quickly. No, that's a joke. But at its core, I mean, CDS is a set of APIs. And it's a way that allows cities to digitally represent their curbs and communicate to curb users in different ways. And so I love this graphic because I think it speaks to the kindergartner in me in a lot of ways. But what is essentially representing is a series of curb activities, whether that's delivery, whether that's a taxi or TNC pickup or drop off, and then that is being captured by different technologies that are available to capture that information and those activities in real time. It's being communicated, the metrics are being communicated to the city that is managing that right of way, and it's actually able to kind of clear, if you will, or approve the activities that are then happening at the curb. The idea here being is that in a perfect world, that the curb space is being made available to those who need it at the time that they need it, and it will reduce the amount of circulating and curb violations. So CDS in practice, there are an increasing number of use cases here, but the flexibility that's built into the curb data specification means that it can be used for lots of different scenarios. And I think one of the most important ones and the reason it's at the top of the list there is to allow the digital sharing of these regulations, so that whether you're trying to make a delivery, or if you're an operator trying to make a delivery, or you're a driver trying to pick up or drop off a person, you don't have to, or quite frankly, if you're just a member of the public who wants to park, and understand what the parking regulations are in a particular neighborhood, you don't have to try to interpret physical signs. You will be able to understand digitally those regulations and whether or not you're allowed to park there, for how long, and under what terms. Determining that real-time curb status, tracking and analyzing curb usage, responding to curb violations. Ultimately, as a manager of the curb, I want to be able to automatically ping a vehicle if they have violated that space with a citation, or perhaps if they go over the allotted time that they paid for to park there, it automatically extends the time and perhaps charges them more for that utilization. And then optimizing the curb usage and the access to meet policy goals. I think ultimately a large driver here is to make the curb more efficient, so that the urban mobility ultimately works better for all of us that are trying to move through it, no matter what mode we're in or on. And with that, thank you.
Hello. Scroll down. Yeah, either one of those. I put a PowerPoint version in there too. Is this on? Yeah. Cool. Hi, I'm Matty Schaefer. I'm the CEO and co-founder of VADE. You can go ahead. We kind of bring it full circle, and we are back into physical infrastructure, but it's also digital, sort of. We put cameras on poles and see what happens at the curb, but we do it automatically with computer vision, and that's a big unlock. Because then, like, if you actually have somebody just watching footage, they have no leverage, so it's like, one person can only do 24 hours in a day. And we make our own cameras. We're kind of a camera manufacturer of sorts, and in specific, we do it because we can make them fully wireless. So it's solar powered, cellular connected, and you can put them up on a pole without needing to draw down power or needing like network connectivity. And this whole presentation is kind of going to be like talking about how we derived our solution based on how it fits within like the landscape of policy and whatnot, but all of my context around policy is based on that, so yeah, bear with me. Next. So we build an end-to-end solution. We manufacture the cameras, we install it, we maintain it, we provide the software, the data, the analytics, and we provide that like on an API or a visualization or a dashboard. And it begs the question, like, why build end-to-end, right? There are cameras that exist that you can buy, and you don't need to make them yourselves, and it would be a lot easier not to. But we, by being end-to-end and controlling kind of every single piece of technology that's going into it, we can hyper-optimize what we're doing and like the attributes of our solution to this specific use case, curb management. And the wireless functionality is kind of just the first example of doing that. Because they're wireless, we can install and maintain them ourselves a lot easier. We don't need to draw down power, so we hire like field techs in a given city, and you know, like we're well below the point on even like power poles where there's like licenses needed and stuff. So like it's just a 10-foot ladder and a person, and then that allows us to offer everything kind of in one wrapped up subscription, which is a really key part because there's no CapEx for cities. It's all just they're paying for the data that's being generated constantly, and it's all under the guise of how do we minimize the barriers to adoption of cities getting real-time data of stuff going on at their curbs. Next. And removing those barriers to adoptions matters a lot because curb management is fundamentally a policy problem, and I don't actually know what policy is supposed to mean by definition. Like it could be used like curb policies, but also like in this scenario, I'm largely, I guess it also includes that, but like municipal code type of policy, and not a technology problem. Like the technology to automatically like manage a curb or analyze data, like all the technology has existed for a while. It's nothing new, but using it in such a way that supports the development and design of policy that actually works and accomplishes the outcomes that cities want to accomplish. That's the hard part. And you really can't avoid the policy part of this equation. That is one example of, this was a recent project. It was the first time we work with consultants in a bunch of areas, and like, we'll usually let them make recommendations, and we just like, here's the data. But we were asked out of curiosity to see what we would recommend and where they go. And so on the left side, you can see kind of just like one type of view on a map representing data. I think the borders there, like the color of the borders of the polygons was the average number of violations per day. And then the fill color was how many minutes were spent in violation per day. And these violations were wild. They were both parking across like angled parking spots and double parking. And like when we went in, you know, we weren't expecting that many. It was over 3 months and only like 9 or 10 cameras. And there were 1,300 examples. It was insane. And so interestingly, like we're kind of just now like really diving deep into the world of like GIS and maps and line segments for curbs, and seeing the geographical relationship of the data, like we saw firsthand this the first time we've been asked to make a recommendation or like what we would do. Basically, the red areas are on those vertical streets, right? And then the green areas are on the main Howard Street and then the one way up top, but we can kind of ignore that. Because the red areas are where there's the most violations occurring and the biggest problem, rather than putting just like one new, loading zone or that type of thing in each zone, we figured why not double up on the vertical streets? So then you can leave that middle street clear of it, and keep that for consumer parking so that there were a ton of like local businesses there. And then the spillover from that middle Howard Street could just use one of the extra ones on the vertical streets. I didn't explain that well, but I think you get what I mean. And it was really interesting to see, like, oh, this is why maps matter. Oh, this is awesome. So this was from our first project in Sarasota, Florida. We worked with Walker Consultants, and they very much handheld us through a painful 3 months and a couple hundred hours of learning how these data pipelines work for the first real time. And that chart on the right is comparing, and it was created by the consultants we were working with. It was comparing what the data would have represented in the old way and what it showed with our way. Now, what's the difference between the two, right? The old way is you send a dude, like you pay $100,000 and a dude goes out, or a woman, and grabs a lawn chair and a six-pack and sits there and marks once an hour how many vehicles are there, right? And so the data that we generated in this project was, I think we actually did like once per 30 seconds, but we aggregated it by the minute anyway, so basically once per minute versus once per hour in terms of data points. There were 4 different areas we were looking at, so each kind of quadrant of that circle is 24 hours in a different area. And you see how there's like dark tips and like lighter shades of the color as the base? So the lighter base is the utilization, the percentage of time it was utilized that we reported with minute by minute data. And then the dark tip is if it was aggregated by hour, because if they looked at during that hour and it was occupied at all, it's occupied for that hour. And in the really high demand areas, like logically, it doesn't show much of a difference because it's very, like nearly fully utilized either way. But in the medium and low demand areas, it isn't just an extreme difference, but it's really inconsistent. On some spaces, it might be, or in some hours, it would be like we would report a 20% utilization rate, and if it had been done in the old way, it would have reported an 80% utilization rate. And then the very next hour could have been like way closer. And so the inconsistency, like our conclusion, we got all excited, like, oh my God, every decision made, like urban planning and all this for the last century was based on false data. Like, this is so exciting. And then that's kind of, we haven't figured out how to turn that into a more positive pitch yet. But it was very validating. Next. And of course, in order for us to, in most of those, like when it's 10 cameras, you can just hard code in the policy, you know? You can say like, okay, I know this camera's here, so the data from it, if longer than 2 hours, then violation. But beyond 10 cameras, that gets like absolutely impossible. So the prerequisite to us doing this and really scaling with it and expanding from a kind of pilot or entry type of let's answer a question and provide data that we know, like honestly, most of the projects is like the city knows the problem's there and they just need data to bring to council. But to go beyond that, we need to be able to automate the interpretation of the activity. What does it mean? In the context of the rules and regulations, is it okay? Is it in compliance? Yeah, that's the right phrase. And that's where CDS comes in, of course. And then when all of it comes together, we are just now starting to like be asked these fascinating questions. The most recent one was the second one I want to point out. So this is kind of, as we go on and on over time, we'll continue building kind of just up the stack and go from like we're just measuring stuff to we're more managing it. And we'll kind of, yeah, it adds license plates, basically. This was a pilot where we were looking at a travel lane. There was no parking lane. There's no curb lane where a vehicle could ever park. It was just a road of 4 travel lanes, one way, maybe 3. And it was actually right outside of the parking building where people would go to pay tickets. And they brought us in and they were like, okay, so many people are parking illegally. We've put up 6 signs that say you cannot park here ever. There's a garage right next to it. And so we put a camera up and we looked at just this one curb space, just one one space. And given an 100% capture rate at the, it was the annualized citation revenue value for that one camera and one curb space was like $156,000. But it begged the question, the $100 in that particular scenario, double parking, blocking a travel lane, that citation amount is based on the fact that they know they're only giving it 5% of the time. And so they wouldn't use the same value or structure even if they were giving it 100% of the time. And of course, if you can give it 100% of the time, you can't really not, because then if the purpose of enforcement is a tool to influence change in behavior, it's hard to make an argument that doing it less than 100% of the time is going to better accomplish that, maybe, though. So then how do we change the fine structure, or how that even works? And it's like a whole rabbit hole to go down, and I think it has to, like, if you're measuring the nearby spaces, depends if they had the option to park legally nearby, then it should be pretty high, but if it was absolutely impossible, it could, like, scale or something. I don't know, I'm still working through that idea. But there's a lot of interesting questions here. Like, if you are now variably setting the rules and rates of curb space based on demand at the time, it's not just like all users are created equal. And an example I use often is it's the city's role and never ours to decide how much more important is a handicapped citizen than a UPS driver. Like, literally a number, like 50% more important, like, you're weighting variables here. And then this is a tough question of, when does equitability hold back and hurt more than it helps, more than it's worth? And, like, the question there is, if you're constantly changing the rules of certain curb space, unless it's on a sign, somehow, some people aren't going to be able to know where it is. Not everybody has a newer car or a phone or a, yeah. And then the bottom there, this one I came out just like while I was making this. I believe today, if we could fast forward like the ecosystem by a decade, but then we still had today's amount of vehicles and whatnot, I believe congestion's solvable today. I would bet that by the time we get there, it won't be anymore. But even if it was right now, would you choose to solve congestion and have really great, perfectly efficient throughput, or would you turn that road into like a walking only place and put sidewalks, knowing that it's still going to keep some congestion on other areas, but it's more livable and it's more attractive and we can kind of trend towards Amsterdam? Interesting questions. And that's it.